Hey everyone, tonight's story takes a darker turn. An era of plagues, punishments, and potage. We're exploring the harsh realities of medieval life. Forget the castles and knights. Hollywood actually showed you the truth you wouldn't survive even one day. Before you settle in, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly appreciate my content. Also drop a comment with your location and current time. I love seeing where everyone is listening from globally. Go ahead and lower the lights, perhaps switch on a fan for that gentle hum, and let's slowly drift into tonight's adventure. Congrats, you've just opened your eyes in the year 1325. The bright side? You're breathing. The downside? The fleas are too. Your mattress is a decaying straw heap crawling with insects and hay. The odor is exactly what you'd expect from a barn floor, because that's exactly what it was a few months ago. No memory foam here. No pillows. Certainly no plush cotton sheets. Only a wool blanket that hasn't seen soap since last winter, now heavy as a small calf from all the built-up filth. You open your eyes to the distant clang of a church bell. That's the medieval alarm clock, harsher and more relentless than anything you've known. Your house is a single-room wooden shack with no windows, and an open layout where your relatives, animals, and household bugs all coexist. And that smell, it's a real medley, a delicate mix of flat beer, body odor, goat, and a mystery scent you desperately hope isn't mildew. Deep down, though, you're certain it is. Nobody's invented scented candles yet, and even if they had, they'd only liquefy on your earthen floor. You attempt to stretch, but instantly wish you hadn't. The cold air stings, and your joints protest. At 22, you're essentially middle-aged by medieval standards. Your back pops like a rusty hinge, and your knees rattle like a sack of stones in a dazed farmer's hands. Rising from bed is a risky move. The ground is either damp from yesterday's rain seeping through the straw roof, or crusty from whatever your neighbor's chicken left behind. Either way, your naked feet have joined the local biome. And privacy? Never heard of it. Your whole family plus a cousin who never moved out is waking up next to you. There's no separate sleeping quarters. No drapes, no alone time, just shared everything. That's morning in medieval Europe. You're never solitary because bugs, rats, and 8 other humans are permanent company. And this is merely the beginning. It'll only deteriorate. So you've successfully extricated yourself from your nightmare. Hey pile, well done. Now your body demands attention. And it's not a gentle request, it's a yell. This is the moment you start longing for a modern restroom. No toilet, no seat, no paper, no flush, not even a resentful plunger in the corner. In the 1300s, answering nature's call is an expedition, a sociological study, and sometimes a minor public spectacle if you're a commoner. Your lavatory is probably a wooden pail, outback already overflowing because Uncle Wolfstan suffered through a night of spoiled turnips. The stench is monumental. You hold your breath, take care of things, and then comes the twist. You throw it into the street. That's right, the street. You're meant to yell something like Gardaloo before heaving it from the window. That's old French for look out down there. But honestly, nobody ever dodges quickly enough. Medieval town streets function as open drains, a picturesque stream of excrement, manure, and unidentifiable fluids you'd prefer not to analyze. If you're fortunate enough to reside somewhere with public toilets, congratulations. You'll be squeezed elbow to elbow with strangers in a stall where seclusion doesn't exist and airflow is a bad joke. You could engage in light conversation, but avoid inhaling deeply. The concept of toilet paper doesn't exist. Folks generally clean themselves with straw, leaves, rags, moss, or if they're feeling fancy, a piece of wool. Occasionally nothing, which probably explains why handshakes hadn't caught on. And what about castle dwellers? Must be an improvement, yes, kind of. You could have a garderobe, a slot in the stone that sends your business straight into the moat. Smart setup, except the enemy is aware of it. And yes, invading soldiers sometimes crawled up through that very chute. Now that's what you call a back-agey door entry. So whether you're a peasant or a noble, the medieval bathroom experience is a degrading ceremony. It's chilly, exposed, risky, and always repulsive. A single misstep on a damp cobblestone, and you're face down in everyone's refuse, and you haven't even cleaned your teeth yet. More on that shortly. You made it through the latrine ordeal, so you've earned a treat, correct? Perhaps a hearty breakfast, something hot and soothing. No such luck. This is medieval Europe. Comfort doesn't exist. The morning meal, if you can even use that term, is a sad event. No eggs Benedict, no perking coffee maker, and absolutely no avocado toast. You settle or crouch by the hearth with a wooden dish containing a substance that resembles mud scraped from a boot. That's your daily serving of potage, a dense, sludgy soup concocted from any available ingredients. Cereals, root veggies, perhaps some beans, if fortune smiles. That pot has been bubbling for days, maybe weeks, with fresh additions simply tossed onto the remnants. It's not so much a dish as a perpetual culinary laboratory. Alongside, there's a piece of bread tough enough to turn away arrows. That bread is baked from rough rye or barley flour, often stretched with sawdust, crushed acorns, or similar inventive fillers. Why? Because wheat is a luxury only the wealthy dream of. This loaf is no ally, you don't cut it, you bargain with it. As for beverages, forget orange juice or oat milk lattes. So, you're sipping on beer, right? Beer first thing in the morning at 6 a.m.? Well, that's because the water's crawling with parasites and filth. So your day kicks off with a low-alcohol weak ale that keeps you alive. Even the kids drink it, no one's thrilled about it. But hey, it won't kill you. Right away, you're craving some meat or cheese. Fat chance meat's reserved for Sundays and saints' feast days, and only when your Lord decides to be generous. For most peasants, meat appears on the table maybe a handful of times annually. And fruit? Only when it's in season and hasn't already been turned into wine. Forget about spices, unless you're royalty, just a pinch of pepper will set you back more than a month's pay. Salt is precious enough to be kept under lock and key, so you chew on that gritty bread and wash it down with medieval beer. And try not to picture the rat that might have snacked on your porridge overnight. Breakfast doesn't exactly fuel you up, it's more like something that just happens. Now that you're thoroughly undernourished, it's time to labor as if your life depends on it, because it does. So after that depressing medieval breakfast, you get dressed, though it won't do you much good. Your entire wardrobe is a single outfit, a coarse wool tunic or linen shift that you've been wearing daily for months, maybe years. Forget seasonal fashion. You just keep wearing it until it falls apart or gives you a fungal infection. Underwear? Totally optional. If you're fortunate, you might have a linen under tunic. If not, you're going commando beneath multiple scratchy, sweaty wool layers, all stitched together with questionable craftsmanship. The person who made them probably had no clue what a proper seam looks like. And there's no washing machine, no soap, and definitely no dry cleaner around. As a result, your clothes are stained, stiff, and smell like a compost heap that's been soaking in a pig pen. Even if you wanted to launder them, it's no simple task. You'd need to fetch water from a river or well, heat it over a fire, and scrub your tunic on a board using ashes or lye. Then you'd hang it to dry in the sun, which makes an appearance maybe 3 days a year. And let's not even talk about footwear. If you're lucky enough to own shoes, they're made from untreated leather, roughly stitched, and provide about as much arch support as a banana peel. Most peasants simply walk barefoot through mud, manure, and what you might call medieval landmines, sharp stones and puddles of disease. The result? Your skin absolutely despises you. You're forever itching. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs make themselves at home on your body, rent-free. Everyone's infested nobles, lousy monks, itchy kids, walking insect farms. Nobody gets a pass. You'll find yourself scratching your armpit with a wooden spoon while making conversation with the parish priest, and no one will raise an eyebrow. Your skin, rubbed raw from scratching your scalp, looks like a battlefield of bites. And if a rash shows up, well, tough luck. There's no dermatologist, no hydrocortisone cream, and nobody to diagnose it as scabies. So you just endure it. And if you're lucky enough to avoid an infection, that rash will stick around for half a year like an unwelcome medieval companion. Now that you're dressed in misery and bundled in discomfort, it's time to step outside and start working until you collapse. Now that you're fully clad in itches and damp wool, it's time to show off your morning smile. But you don't, because in the Middle Ages, smiling is a perilous activity, not emotionally, but dentally. There's no toothbrush, toothpaste, mouthwash, or floss. The very idea of oral hygiene is about as common as bathing, meaning not at all. A few folks might gnaw on a twig or swish with wine or vinegar. But by and large, your teeth are left to fend for themselves, and they're in rough shape. By the time you're in your mid-20s, your grin resembles something out of a haunted crypt. Cavities are everywhere, and your gums are puffy. And those marks on your teeth aren't just food stains, that's actual decay. Your mouth holds more rot than a medieval root cellar. Sugar, though not yet widespread, is becoming more common among the wealthy, imported at high prices and used mainly in small pastries or as a display of riches. If you're a noble, congratulations, you get to decay your teeth faster than any peasant. If you're poor, it's a slow process from fermented bread, gritty porridge, and years of hard chewing, leading to constant toothaches. Learn to live with them, they're like medieval weather, perpetually lurking in the background. We're talking about pain so intense that you'd think about prayer, alcohol, or yanking the tooth out yourself with pliers, and that's no joke. That was the real treatment. There were no real dentists, but barber surgeons definitely existed. The very same fellow who trims your hair is also extracting your molars by candlelight using an iron hook with absolutely no anesthesia. If your tooth gets infected, Well, prepare for fevers, because without antibiotics, it can quickly escalate to sepsis and take you out all from a simple toothache. That's the reality. Something that would send us to the pharmacy today could be your funeral back in the 1300s, and socially, there's no respite either. Kissing? Forget it, halitosis is rampant. If you're unmarried, your worth isn't based on your smile but on your land and livestock. In a nutshell, your mouth is a war zone, and it's losing the battle as your teeth throb. So let's venture outside, because your real work, the kind that will break your back, is just beginning. Time to go to your job, except there's no office, no desk, no coffee breaks, and zero chance of advancement. If you're among the 90% of the population, your job is straightforward. Don't die while toiling for someone else's comfort. You're a peasant, congratulations. That means you farm the land owned by a lord. You, who may not recall your own identity, awaken at dawn and labor until the sun vanishes beyond the forest. Your equipment consists of a wooden hoe, a rusty sickle, and whatever bones in your body haven't given out yet. There's no such thing as a weekend or punching out. It's just dawn till dusk, 6 days every week. Sunday gives you rest, but only if you aren't harvesting, defending against attackers, or desperately praying that your infected toe stops turning black. The labor is harsh. Fields are tilled manually, or with an ox, if you're wealthy enough to own one. You excavate trenches, scatter seeds, remove weeds, and haul water until your spine starts curving like the letter S. Nobody cares about your fatigue, and nobody asks about your mental well-being. If you're a woman, surprise, your work isn't limited to the fields. You also look after children, tidy up, prepare meals, spin wool, tend to animals, and pretend that your husband's lice infestation isn't slowly crossing over to your side of the bed. Children begin helping out around age 5. No education, no playthings, just a small wooden rake and a hope of eventually not perishing from the flu. And if you're among the lucky few who isn't a farmer, maybe you're a blacksmith, a tanner, or a barrel maker. Excellent. You still spend your days dealing with fire, chemicals, or animal intestines in poorly aired workshops. Compensation basically keeps you alive. Benefits include occasional bleeding, shatter a bone, tough luck. Get a fever? Down some warm ale and keep moving. You can't afford to halt, not even for a single day, because without work there's no food, and without enough food, medieval Europe has a remedy for that. It's called being replaced. So you clutch your shovel, ignore the blisters, and continue digging, because in the Middle Ages your occupation isn't a profession, it's a drawn-out test of endurance. Now that your back is blazing from fieldwork, let's discuss the climate. Because during the medieval period, temperature isn't really about seasons, it's more like constant punishment from above. Let's begin with winter. No insulation, no central heating, no weatherproofing, just wooden walls with cracks large enough to toss a chicken through. Your windows are covered with cloth, not glass. The hearth fire is nice in theory, but you lack enough wood to keep it blazing. Wood is pricey, and collecting it from the forest is sometimes prohibited. Yes, you can be put to death for picking up the wrong branch from the wrong woodland. You wrap up in your single damp wool tunic, gather near the fading coals, and still wake up with a frozen nose. Your feet are perpetually cold, often moist. Your fingers so stiff they feel like tiny medieval ice pops. Frostbite isn't diagnosed, it's simply labeled bad fortune. Now, speed ahead to summer. That sounds better, doesn't it? Wrong. In summer, your home becomes a clay furnace. No fan, no cross breeze, and definitely no deodorant. You perspire through your layers but can't remove them because revealing too much skin is scandalous. It also invites sunburns, bug bites, and social disapproval. Flies swarm, attracted to your unwashed body, and the smell of last week's goat stew still rotting in the corner. Mosquitoes hum by your ear as you try to sleep, assuming you can sleep through the noise of neighbors yelling and babies weeping. In the fields, the sun bakes you without sunscreen or a hat, unless you made one from straw like a desperate scarecrow. And the worst part, you still have to work. Heat stroke is just called having a bad spell. So you're either shivering in your hovel, wondering if your toes will survive until spring, or you're sweating through your only pair of socks while your thighs rub raw. And one thing never changes. Whatever the season, your clothes still itch, your food still tastes awful, and your next task is still waiting. Welcome to climate control. Medieval style there is none. Feeling parched? Need to clean up or splash some water on your face to wake from this damp fever dream of a life? Too bad. In medieval times, water isn't your friend, it's quietly trying to kill you. Let's start with drinking. The nearby stream looks fresh, bubbling, and clear like something from a fantasy film. But spoiler alert, it's not upstream. Someone just emptied a chamber pot into it, and if not that, a dead pig is likely decomposing there. Parasites, bacteria, and the entire microbial army of medieval Europe await in every gulp. That's why people drank beer. Yes, beer, even children. But before you picture medieval kids doing keg stands, understand it was small beer, low in alcohol, high in survival value. Brewing boiled the water, making it safer than whatever flowed through the town. Wine from ditches was another option, if you were wealthy enough to afford it, and didn't mind functioning poorly before noon. What about bathing? Surely water was used for cleaning. In theory, yes. In practice, absolutely not. You see, back then people believed bathing actually opened your pores and let diseases in. That's right, washing yourself was considered medically dangerous. You were apparently cleaner if you never removed the protective layer of filth crusted onto your skin. Communal bathhouses did exist, but they quickly gained reputations as places for gossip, scandal, and sometimes full-on medieval extracurriculars. So naturally the church got involved and shut many down. Even if you did want to bathe, it was a major production. You'd need to fetch water from the well, boil it over a fire, fill a leaky wooden tub, and then pray nobody else in the house used it before you, or worse, after. Rainwater sits in open barrels where birds drop waste, insects multiply, and algae grows. Sounds refreshing, right? So, whether you drink it, wash with it, or pour it over your crops, water in medieval times isn't so much a source of life as it is a roll of the dice. One bad swallow, and you'll spend your last days sweating on a straw mattress, holding your belly, and questioning every decision you've ever made. Next time you take a sip from the tap, toast to our ancestors they never got to enjoy hydration without hazard. So maybe you drank that water, or maybe you didn't. Maybe you just banged your toe on a stone shaped like misery. Either way, you're ill. You need assistance. You need a physician. Too bad you're stuck in the Middle Ages, where medicine is basically polite torture dressed up with a theology degree. Let's talk about figuring out what's wrong. Whatever ails you, a cough, a rash, a broken limb, or the creeping plague, it's all because your humors are off balance. The four humors are blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to medieval science, your health depends on keeping them balanced, like some kind of internal stew. Running a fever? Too much blood. The solution: bloodletting. That's right. Let's drain your life essence into a bowl using a dull knife or a hungry leech. And yes, barbers often perform the task. Imagine getting a trim and a hemoglobin extraction. In one visit, 2 services. Baby feeling sad or anxious? Clearly an overabundance of black bile. The remedy: laxatives, a warm herbal purge, or prayers with a cold compress, while everyone avoids eye contact and starts measuring you for a coffin. Now, if you snap a bone or get a nasty wound, you're in deep trouble because there's no anesthesia unless you count passing out from agony. Surgery uses knives that haven't been cleaned since the Crusades, and tools get heated over fire not to sterilize them, but to look more menacing. Antibiotics are centuries off. Germ theory doesn't exist yet, and people think disease comes from foul air or a god angry at your sins. Stomachache? Must be your sinful thoughts hope you enjoy confessing while you're throwing up. If your condition worsens, you'll be treated with more leeches, maybe some crushed beetles, and a priest by your bed giving last rites. Just in case, at this point, they're getting ready for the cure called death. If you somehow recover, everyone assumes God took pity on you. The doctor takes all the credit, and the leech gets a promotion. So yes, in the Middle Ages, medicine isn't about healing, it's about enduring. After a long day of work, the remedy: lice and leeches. It's finally time for dinner. You shuffle back to your hut, stomach rumbling, ready for one of life's few pleasures: a hot meal. Bad news. That meal is probably trying to kill you. Let's start with the basics. Food preservation barely exists. No fridge, no freezer, just salt, smoke, or hoping winter air keeps things fresh. Your meat, if you're fortunate enough to have any, has been hanging for days. It's crawling with flies, soaking in questionable brine, and possibly shared with a rat or two. Bread is the cornerstone of the medieval diet, but even that isn't safe when harvests are bad. Desperate peasants stretch it by mixing in bark, sawdust, or even clay. And if it's rye season, there's a bonus: ergot, a fungus that triggers convulsions, hallucinations, and sometimes death. It's like eating bread laced with LSD and tetanus. Vegetables only if they're in season, and you know what's always in season? Turnips, so many turnips, boiled, mashed, or floating in pottage. Pottage, as you might recall from Chapter 3, is basically a hot swamp of mystery ingredients that's been simmering since your great-grandfather's funeral. Fruit might be around in autumn, but it rots quickly, and sugar is rare. It's expensive and hoarded by the rich to show off their blackened teeth. Dairy is another gamble. Fresh milk sours in hours, but butter and cheese last longer, though they're packed with bacteria. People eat them anyway because, honestly, it's either that or gnaw on your boot leather. And let's talk seasoning. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg. Forget it. Flavor comes from onions worth more than gold for the average peasant salt if you're lucky, and pain. Most meals taste like wet burlap sprinkled with misery. But food isn't just a health hazard, it's a political one. Game animals belong to the Lord, not you. You could be fined, imprisoned, or even executed. That's right, your dinner could get you hanged. So as you sit down to eat your gray stew by flickering firelight, remember every bite is a risk, but you eat anyway. Because in the Middle Ages, food doesn't nourish. It tests you. It's evening now. You've worked, suffered, and barely digested your suspicious stew. You might think the day is ending, but don't get too comfortable because God is watching. So is the priest, and so is your neighbor Agnes, who will absolutely turn you in if you skip Mass. In medieval Europe, religion isn't just a part of life, it is life. The church controls your calendar, your laws, your education, your birth, marriage, death, and everything in between. Think of it as your spiritual landlord, and you're always behind on rent. Every day is structured around prayer bells. The town church bell rings at morning, noon, and night, not because people need reminders, but because missing prayer is a sin. If you forget to bow, that's a sin. Eating meat on a Friday? Also a sin. Having a dream about your neighbor's wife? That's a double sin. And yes, hell is absolutely real. Priests paint a vivid picture. Rivers ablaze, lakes of boiling blood, demons with pitchforks, and endless screaming. If the plague doesn't frighten you, eternal damnation surely will. Eternal damnation will scare you because it's all written in Latin, a language only monks, clergy, and that one stuck-up noble kid understand. You depend on the church to explain everything. So if your priest tells you your crops failed because you weren't devout enough, you'd better kneel harder and pay more tithes. You're required to give 1/10 of everything you produce. If you grow wheat, you give wheat. If you raise chickens, you hand over eggs. If you have nothing, well, you're still expected to give something. So, congratulations, you're spiritually broke and financially wrecked. Holidays are holy days, dozens of them. Sure, you get a break from work, but they're not for enjoyment. They're for Mass, fasting, confessing your sins, and reminding yourself that happiness is a risky luxury. Questioning the church? That's even riskier. Heretics get burned, witches get drowned, blasphemers get flogged, and skeptics quickly learn to keep quiet. So you just go through the motions chanting, bowing, praying that after this grimy life your soul reaches paradise, provided the priest approves. In the Middle Ages, God might show mercy, but the church? Not so much. If you think being a medieval peasant was tough, imagine doing it as a woman. All the dirt, hunger, and dread, plus childbirth, submission, and being socially invisible. Being a woman is like playing the game on hard mode, no health potions, no reset. From birth, a girl's future is already set. You marry young, have children, serve your husband, and die exhausted. Education is rare unless you're noble and packed off to a convent. Your brain stops growing around the time you master churning butter and darning a tunic. And marriage? It happens very, very early. Being betrothed at 12 and pregnant by 14? Totally normal. Love has nothing to do with it. It's all about land, animals, and political ties. Your opinion? Not needed. After marriage, you're pretty much your husband's possession. Your duties: bear children, cook, clean, manage the household, and never, ever complain. If you complain, you might be called a nag or worse, a witch. That label comes with a free drowning or burning, depending on the local trend. Giving birth is like playing a death lottery. No prenatal care, no sterile instruments, no anesthesia. Midwives try their hardest, but even small problems can kill the mother, the baby, or both. Some women make it through 10 pregnancies, but many don't survive too. And don't relax once the baby's born. Your workload actually goes up. So now you've got a wailing baby in a lice-infested hovel, and you're supposed to breastfeed, cook, scrub, and also work in the fields. You never rest, you're the one everyone else rests on. Unmarried? Suspicious. Widowed? Vulnerable. Outspoken? Dangerous. Women who didn't fit the mold were frequently labeled witches, especially if they knew about herbs, had a strong will, or simply gave someone a weird look on a rainy Tuesday. Even inside the church, your role is confined. Nuns follow rigid rules, no talking without permission, no freedom to move around, and your spiritual value is always considered lower than a man's. Bottom line, if you're a medieval woman, you're supposed to endure, obey, bear children, and suffer quietly. Preferably with a smile, because even in an era of widespread misery, women were expected to suffer with grace. You've already fought mud, hunger, unfair treatment, and maybe even a goat. Just when you believe things can't get worse, violence arrives loud, bloody, and totally normal by medieval standards. Make no mistake, the Middle Ages were anything but peaceful. Law and order basically meant praying your local lord was in a good mood. Violence lurks everywhere at home, on the streets, in battle, during church arguments, even in the queue at the shared bread oven. Crime happens often, punishments are savage, and justice feels more like a show than real protection. Steal one loaf of bread, you could lose a hand. Get caught lying, they might pierce your tongue. If you gossip excessively, you'll get the scold's bridle, a metal cage locked onto your head with a spike in your mouth, all for your own correction. Now, suppose you're accused of something major: heresy, stealing, witchcraft. How do you prove you're innocent? Through torture? Naturally. Welcome to trial by ordeal. One method: plunge your hand into boiling water to pull out a stone. If the injury heals cleanly in 3 days, you're innocent. If not, you're guilty. Another option: throw you into a river. Sink? Innocent, but likely drowned. Float? Guilty, and you'll be punished regardless. It's like a medieval game show where the grand prize is staying alive, and the host is definitely not on your side. If you're condemned to die, it becomes a public spectacle. Executions happen before cheering audiences, hangings, beheadings, burnings. Sometimes people even bring snacks. It's basically medieval cable television. Domestic violence was totally acceptable. Husbands had the right, and even the duty, to correct their wives and kids. Street brawls were ordinary. You might get beaten just for glancing wrong at a nobleman's horse. And war was always brewing. Local grudges, land conflicts, holy crusades. Someone is constantly marching out to stab another person for honor, for God, or simply out of boredom. Violence wasn't a sign of society collapsing in the Middle Ages. It was society itself. Everyone lives knowing that life is short, justice is random, and your neighbor might crush your skull for a pig. So step carefully, keep your gaze lowered, and never trust anyone carrying a club. You've survived the lice, the leeches, the laundress, and the constant misery. You've dodged the threat of being publicly disemboweled, but here's the last part of most medieval stories: dying young and without any glory. If you're still breathing after turning 40, you're basically a legend. People might call you the Ancient, which isn't just a nickname, it's basically a statistical wonder. Here's the math. Average life expectancy sat around 30 to 40 years, but that figure is pulled way down because so many infants died. Almost half of kids never saw their 5th birthday. A sickness, starvation, or just a harsh winter could finish you off. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no real hope. Once you made it past childhood, you stepped into adulthood completely worn out. You started working as soon as you could stand, and by age 25, your joints groaned like an old monastery hinge. You'd likely be down a few teeth, a finger, and pretty much all your early optimism. For women, childbirth was an especially lethal obstacle course. It ranked among the top killers for medieval women. No painkillers, no doctor's help, only prayer, hot water, and a hand to hold. As you bled out on a straw mattress, for men the hazards were different, but just as unyielding. Farming mishaps, infections from small cuts, a drunken neighbor's fury, a crusade that went wrong. Even a trip to the marketplace might be dangerous if you encountered a lazy outlaw or a furious tax official. Death might also arrive silently through the plague, which transformed cities into graveyards in a single night, or from hunger that could stretch for months, wiping out whole communities, or from sheer misfortune like consuming rotten grain. You'd spend your last moments seeing things and yelling at the walls. As for a funeral, you were fortunate to get one at all. Corpses were usually interred fast to prevent sickness. No preservation, no fancy caskets, only a pit, some whispered blessings, and a low heap of dirt if there was any room left in the cemetery. So yes, during the Middle Ages, existence was harsh, brief, and forever threatened by mortality. In all its ordinary ways, you never retired, you simply stopped appearing. And since we're talking about leaving, let's get to your last part. The medieval fantasy crumbles. So how's your day going? You woke up in grime, used a bucket as a toilet, cleaned your teeth with optimism, and almost fainted from starvation. You labored until your back begged for relief, and you itched your way through scratchy wool. You offered prayers to avoid the plague, and narrowly escaped being executed in public just for having a pet squirrel. That's a typical day in medieval Europe. Still fantasizing about knighthood? Better reconsider. That idealized image of the medieval period: brave swordsmen, aristocratic ladies in towers, epic fights and banquets in torchlit dining rooms, it's all fiction polished by folklore and fantasy novels. In reality, medieval society was rough, merciless, and profoundly unjust, with a rigid class system. If you entered the world poor, you remained poor. If you were born into wealth, good for you, you had a higher chance of making it. But you were just one spoiled stew away from dysentery and a quick burial. Even aristocrats couldn't escape suffering. Castles were chilly stone iceboxes crawling with fleas, filled with smoke, and plagued by marriages arranged for political gain. Sure, you might own a fur coat and a wine cup, but you also faced a 50% likelihood of perishing in a minor battle or from a contaminated wood splinter. Not really a life of comfort, the so-called simpler days weren't easy. They were unyielding. Every task consumed more time. Everything caused more pain. From giving birth to eating, every action had a price. Existence was about enduring, not relaxing. And even if you managed to snatch a peaceful moment to reflect, to wish, to envision a better life, you couldn't do much with it. There was no social climbing, no advanced healthcare, no online search engine to look up a strange skin irritation. You were born, toiled, endured, and passed away within a 10-mile circle of your birthplace. But here's the most surprising thing. Despite all that, people still chuckled, performed songs, shared tales, experienced love, and discovered purpose. Not because existence was simple, but because humans are resilient in that way. Even in their bleakest periods, they carved room for brightness. So this evening, when you climb into your fresh sheets with running water, modern medicines, and heat that circulates, perhaps offer a silent word of gratitude to today's world and to your forebears who battled rodents, starvation, and medieval social systems so you could avoid that. Long before she became Catherine the Great, Empress of all Russia, champion of change and symbol of drive, she was just Sophie, born Sophie Friederike Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst. In 1729, she was the child of a fairly minor German noble house, and her small principality in Pomerania didn't grant much authority. Yet Sophie possessed something that no rank could give: a mind like a blade, endless charisma, and a deep, smoldering desire for prominence. Her childhood was severe. Her mother Johanna was chilly and scheming, not a loving parent but a social striver fixated on rank. Sophie's father, a Prussian military man, was more than just strict. Starting in her early years, Sophie mastered the delicate balance between compliance and craftiness. She devoured books, was fluent in several tongues, and trained herself to study a room's atmosphere before opening her mouth. Those abilities would quickly turn into essential survival tactics in one of Europe's harshest royal settings. When Empress Elizabeth Petrovna of Russia started hunting for a bride for her successor, Grand Duke Peter, she searched outside of Russia. Peter had German roots himself, and Empress Elizabeth thought that a malleable, appreciative foreign girl would be simpler to manage. Sophie matched the requirements exactly: aristocratic lineage, Protestant religion, which she would be compelled to give up, and a name for elegance and modesty. At only 14 years of age, Sophie received a summons to Russia. In 1744, she reached St. Petersburg's icy capital, clad in light German clothing and wearing a calculated grin. Her mother shoved her ahead like a pawn on a board. But Sophie had her own strategy. To gain acceptance in Russian culture, she changed her faith to Orthodox Christianity. The ceremony where she adopted the name Ekaterina Alexeyevna, Catherine, was a very public, deeply symbolic, and life-changing event. She didn't merely switch faiths. She was cutting all ties, entering a foreign realm with no possibility of return. Nobody observing that reserved, young girl in her fur-trimmed garment could have foreseen the future ahead: betrayal, upheaval, intellectual awakening, and imperial glory. As soon as Sophie set foot in the Russian court, she ceased to be a mere pawn and started plotting her path to queenship. Her marriage to Grand Duke Peter was supposed to cement her position within the Russian royal family. Yet, right from the start, it felt less like wearing a crown and more like being trapped in a cage. Peter, the Russian throne's heir, was nothing like the charming prince from storybooks. He was clumsy, childish, and fixated on miniature armies. His time was spent on mock battles in his private rooms rather than ruling an empire or offering any warmth to his new spouse. Historical records even hint that he avoided consummating the marriage for several years. He worshipped Frederick the Great of Prussia and held a grudge against the Russian court that had taken him in. Meanwhile, Catherine threw herself into Russian culture with burning resolve. She picked up the language, delved into its past, and committed Orthodox rites to memory. Her aim was to fit in, while Peter longed to get away. This difference went beyond personal feelings. It had deep political implications. The Russian court resembled a snake pit full of rumors, suspicion, and ruthless maneuvers for dominance. Empress Elizabeth continued to wield absolute power, but her health was deteriorating. It was clear to all that a change was approaching, and each person had their own hidden motives. Catherine lived under constant surveillance. Her correspondence was inspected, her companions were tracked, and all her actions were carefully observed. She had no reason to trust her spouse, her mother, who continued to murmur advice on behalf of outside powers, or even her own household staff. In this environment, friendships could become charges of treason in a single night. Yet Catherine was far from naive. She mastered the arts of courtly intrigue, patiently building connections behind the scenes. She won over army commanders, befriended intellectuals, and earned a name for herself as poised and self-controlled. This stood in sharp opposition to her husband's immature outbursts and his blatant disrespect for Russian customs. Privately, Catherine started studying the works of Enlightenment philosophers such as Voltaire and Montesquieu. Whereas many perceived her as merely a youthful wife of the ruler, Catherine was crafting a grand plan that extended beyond her own interests. For Russia, she dreamed of a powerful, educated, and rational state. However, a key obstacle remained. As long as Peter survived, Catherine stayed trapped in uncertainty, a spouse without influence to a man incapable of governing. Therefore, she bided her time, kept watch, and strategized. She understood that the Russian crown was not something you simply inherit. You have to grab it. Come 1762, following almost 20 years of patience, vigilance, and silent scheming, Catherine recognized her opportunity and took it with astonishing accuracy. With the death of Empress Elizabeth, Peter became Tsar Peter III, yet his rule started to fall apart almost at once. Within mere months, he managed to turn the church against him, anger the aristocracy, humiliate the military, and shower compliments on Prussia, Russia's enduring foe. He overturned major policies, embarrassed the church leaders, and spoke openly of divorcing Catherine in order to wed his lover. The court, already tired of his unpredictable actions, grew distant. The army, which had commanders loyal to Catherine, murmured discontent in hallways. Even common citizens, deeply religious and patriotic, viewed Peter as an outsider's puppet who ridiculed their customs. Observing these events, Catherine struck in July of that same year, while Peter was staying at his summer residence. She initiated a non-violent overthrow of the government, backed by important military figures, among them her romantic partner Grigory Orlov and his powerful brothers. Dressed in full ceremonial attire, she paraded through St. Petersburg, was declared Empress Catherine II, and secured the loyalty of the formidable imperial guard. Caught unprepared and friendless, Peter gave in. Within a few days he was arrested, and soon thereafter was discovered deceased in puzzling conditions. The official story blamed it on a hemorrhoidal colic, but unofficially everyone knew it was assassination. Catherine had become empress not through lineage, not through her union, but through sheer determination, intelligence, and boldness. This was without precedent. A woman born abroad with no legal right had claimed the Russian crown without any fighting. However, her true test was only starting. She needed to turn that audacious seizure of authority into an enduring impact. Would the Russian people embrace her, and would the aristocrats show her deference? Could she keep the empire unified without suffering her husband's same end? Catherine was well aware that authority won by scheming could vanish just as quickly. She had to govern not as a plotter but as a visionary, and thus started her shift from a cautious intriguer into an empress of reform. She would go on to reshape boundaries, adopt Enlightenment ideals, and change perceptions of women in leadership roles. After Catherine secured the crown, she might have relaxed in her authority, but that wasn't her style. She envisioned something far greater than merely occupying a throne. Her ambition was to overhaul Russia not only in armed strength or governance, but also in its mind. Whereas Peter had adored Frederick the Great in miniature armies, Catherine revered Voltaire, Diderot, and other daring Enlightenment philosophers. She had faith in logic, advancement, learning, and the concept of a ruler serving her people. Although she held absolute power herself, Catherine didn't merely peruse Enlightenment texts, she embodied their principles. Catherine exchanged letters with Voltaire for more than 1.5 decades, complimenting him even as she justified her own absolute rule. She brought Diderot to her palace and bought up his complete book collection to provide him financial aid. In private, she delved into law books, discussed changes, and devised strategies to bring the empire up to date. The first years of her rule were busy with attempts to systematize Russian law. She established the Legislative Commission in 1767. This was a highly ambitious endeavor aimed at completely overhauling Russia's legal framework. Catherine's own nakaz, or directive, was essentially a political declaration concealed as a legal manual. It proclaimed equality under the law, condemned torture, and asserted that rulers must serve the public interest. For a Russian empress in the 1700s, such ideas were revolutionary. Yet the principles of the Enlightenment needed to endure. Russia's reality was a huge, feudal, and deeply conservative territory, where nobles preferred their serfs to stay subjugated. Catherine was aware of this as she pushed for change. She acted cautiously, banning certain torture methods, broadening secular education, and establishing schools and libraries. Yet, to secure their loyalty, she also reinforced the nobility's authority over serfs. This exemplified Catherine's delicate equilibrium: publicly a philosopher, queen, privately a pragmatic ruler. She navigated the thin line between principles and self-preservation, between Paris's glittering salons and Moscow's rough politics. Her plans for Russia were daring, yet meticulously measured. Catherine wasn't really attempting to Europeanize Russia. Instead, she aimed to modernize it according to her own vision. This involved reform, certainly, but wielded with a firm grip concealed in a gentle touch. She was not satisfied with simply changing Russia internally. She aspired to project power outward, forging an empire that commanded fear, respect, and jealousy. While Peter the Great had merely cracked a door to the west, Catherine intended to demolish the barriers entirely. During her rule, Russia's frontiers expanded further than ever. She undertook military campaigns not only to protect her throne but to redraw the European landscape. Her major conflict was with the Ottoman Empire. These battles, erupting repeatedly through the 1760s and 1770s, went beyond land grabs. They centered on power and sway. Catherine viewed herself as the champion of Orthodox Christians oppressed under Muslim governance and the natural guardian of Eastern Europe. With commanders such as Alexander Suvorov and Grigory Potemkin, Russia seized crucial territories: Crimea, the Black Sea's northern shoreline, and warm water harbors, a prize Russian monarchs had long desired. These triumphs had significance beyond mere warfare. They carried deep symbolism. Every takeover broadcast a clear statement. Russia had shed its image as Europe's remote, underdeveloped relative and emerged as a major continental power. She next focused on the West. Through diplomatic bargaining and strategic deals, she engaged in the partitioning of Poland. Together with Austria and Prussia, she dismantled the faltering Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. By the Third Partition in 1795, Poland no longer existed on maps. Russia acquired enormous territories and millions of additional inhabitants. However, Catherine's conquests weren't solely military. She also spread influence through ideology. New urban centers arose, commercial networks grew, and German immigrants were brought in to farm Russian lands. The empire transformed into a patchwork, stretching from the frozen Baltic to the sunny Black Sea coasts. Throughout this process, Catherine was the driving nucleus, reviewing dispatches, issuing commands, and directly supervising the contours of her growing realm. Detractors labeled her as power-hungry and imperialistic, yet Catherine saw expansion not as ambition but as fate. She believed that a monarch's greatness was judged not only by concepts but by territorial extent. Her desire extended beyond governing Russia. She intended to reshape it into a refined empire that adversaries dreaded, allies admired, and that stayed devoted solely to her. Despite her intellect and might, Catherine the Great became equally renowned for events occurring beyond public view, and no, not everything was discussed quietly in libraries. Catherine's personal affairs emerged as one of the most discussed topics of her rule. She kept a series of lovers, not merely a couple, but a deliberately selected procession, frequently much younger, attractive, and occasionally politically powerful. She made no effort to conceal them. Instead, she often granted them titles, lands, and allowances, provided they conducted themselves appropriately. If they misbehaved, they were discreetly let go, occasionally with a courteous thanks and a higher position. One of her most significant lovers was Grigory Potemkin, a man equally intelligent and audacious. Their bond mingled romance, politics, and teamwork. Many scholars suspect they might have entered a secret marriage. They jointly influenced military strategies, settlement initiatives, and the overhaul of southern Russia. Potemkin was far more than a romantic partner. In numerous respects, he acted as a co-sovereign. Nevertheless, Europe could not ignore the controversy. Rumors circulated, mocking pamphlets portrayed her as wanton, greedy, and deranged, and following her death, the tales grew even more vicious. The most notorious story, entirely fabricated and obscene, concerned a horse, circulated by her adversaries to tarnish her memory. Yet what drove this fixation? The answer was straightforward. Catherine was a woman who exercised authority without apology. In an era expecting female monarchs to be either pure saints or sorrowful victims, she rejected that expectation. She existed, loved, and governed according to her own rules, which rendered her threatening. Paradoxically, though her detractors labeled her immoral, Catherine held a profoundly thoughtful perspective on love and intimacy. She considered enjoyment a normal aspect of existence, and thought that personal connections need not jeopardize public duties. She divorced feelings from statecraft, an accomplishment rarely achieved by male sovereigns. In practice, her affairs were frequently tactical. She kept close men who were devoted, skilled, and politically advantageous. When they stopped being so, she released them, typically with a warm goodbye and a comfortable pension. Catherine's romantic entanglements did not undermine her authority. They were integral to her approach, a fusion of desire and strength that rendered her memorable, both envied and dreaded for her magnetism and command. Her reign was not free of danger, and in 1773 that danger emerged in the form of a bearded Cossack, Yemelian Pugachev, who was far from a typical insurgent. Pugachev asserted he was actually Peter III, Catherine's deceased spouse. He alleged that he had escaped the coup and was now returning to seize the throne from the German pretender. The notion was preposterous. Peter had been dead for years. Yet for Russia's downtrodden and weary commoners, the story didn't have to be factual, it only had to provide a glimmer of hope. Pugachev vowed freedom, the abolition of serfdom, reduced taxes, and land for the masses. His message sparked intense fervor throughout the Volga River area, particularly among Cossacks, peasants, and Old Believers. During an era when the divide between aristocrats and serfs had grown harshly, his pledges seemed like deliverance. The Pugachev revolt turned into the most significant peasant insurrection in Russia's history. Cities were captured and strongholds crumbled. Aristocrats were killed, and for a frightening instant, it appeared the entire empire could break apart. Catherine felt disturbed. This was not some external conflict she could resolve with cavalry and diplomatic agreements. This was an internal rebellion, her own subjects revolting against the regime she governed. Yet Catherine did not lose her composure. She took action and sent trained troops to suppress the uprising mercilessly. Pugachev's army was crushed in 1774. He was taken prisoner, exhibited in a metal cage, and ultimately executed by decapitation in Moscow, serving as a public deterrent to any who might imitate him. Subsequently, Catherine intensified her emphasis on discipline and authority. Her aspirations for serf emancipation gradually diminished into obscurity. The uprising demonstrated to her the boundaries of enlightenment within a nation, still constrained by feudalism. She now relied more heavily on the aristocracy, who pledged their allegiance. This deal, granting nobles total authority over their serfs, marked a pivotal moment. The monarch who had earlier cited Voltaire now placed a higher value on stability than on intellectual ideals. Reform grew more restrained, and monitoring intensified. Any hint of insurrection, even just a rumor, had to be crushed before it could develop. Though Pugachev lost his life, he bequeathed a caution that troubled Catherine. Authority founded on disparity could endure only for so long before an inevitable upheaval erupted. By the time Catherine the Great neared the closing years of her existence, she had governed Russia for more than 30 years. Surpassing the tenure of any other female sovereign in Russia's history, from the instant she took control, she consistently surpassed assumptions. She transformed her realm and reconceived the possibilities for both a woman and a ruler. During Catherine's rule, Russia emerged as a genuine European superpower. Its landmass grew by more than 200,000 square miles, incorporating Crimea, sections of Poland, and areas along the Black Sea shoreline. These were not merely military victories. They were calculated shifts that gained access to ice, free harbors, and transformed commerce. However, Catherine's impact extended beyond cartography. She also imprinted a cultural influence. She contributed to establishing the Hermitage Museum, assembled one of Europe's most impressive art assemblages, and exchanged letters with the foremost thinkers of the Enlightenment. Her royal court evolved into a hub of refinement, artistic creativity, and scholarly aspiration. In a nation frequently regarded as underdeveloped by Western Europeans, Catherine secured Russia's prominent position in the cultural sphere. She updated the educational system by establishing institutions for females and encouraging book publishing. She brought smallpox vaccination to Russia, personally undergoing the procedure in public, a bold scientific move for her era. However, her rule was likewise marked by paradoxes. Though she respected Enlightenment principles, she never emancipated the serfs. On the contrary, she expanded serfdom further into Russia's lands. Her changes, though noteworthy, were largely imposed from above, intended to refine the empire without genuinely altering its core structure. Nevertheless, Catherine's governance provided steadiness and drive. She recognized that authority was not simply passed down but was built, directed, and perpetually safeguarded. She governed not through divine entitlement, but via sheer determination, political acumen, and unyielding strategy. She received many labels: an usurper, a despot, a revolutionary, a temptress, yet above all, she was competent. Upon her death in 1796, Russia had become richer, bigger, and more powerful than it had been for hundreds of years. She bequeathed a stable crown, a broadened empire, and a myth that would persist for ages. Catherine did not merely occupy the throne. She governed with intelligence, strategic thinking, and an unashamed hold over historical narratives. By doing so, she transcended being just a monarch. She evolved into a legend. Despite all her might, territorial growth, and lasting influence, Catherine the Great remained fundamentally a woman making her way through a male-dominated society, and she was remolding that society according to her own vision. Concealed beneath the royal paintings and official edicts lay an individual keenly conscious of the fragility of her situation. She was not Russian by birth. She ascended to power via a coup and governed an empire that resisted female leadership. Nonetheless, she not only survived, she flourished. Catherine never felt satisfied merely serving as decoration. She read continuously, wrote profusely, and always pursued knowledge. Her everyday timetable was rigorous, spending hours reviewing documents, exchanging messages with other nations, revising official records, and overseeing a palace crowded with competing groups. She was not content to idly occupy the throne. She operated it with the skill of a stateswoman naturally suited for the role. Additionally, she experienced considerable solitude. She filled her circles with attendants, romantic partners, and creative individuals. Yet in her memoirs, she noted how very few individuals she could genuinely rely on. Her son Paul, whom she distrusted and excluded from governmental affairs, matured into a man she worried would dismantle all her advancements. Her most profound intimate connection, with Grigory Potemkin, eventually transformed into close companionship, yet his passing in 1791 inflicted a wound that never fully mended. Catherine deliberately constructed her public persona. She grasped the influence of storytelling and employed it more skillfully than most rulers of her era. She portrayed herself as the maternal figure of Russia, an enlightened sovereign, a combatant, an empress, and an art enthusiast. However, underlying those identities lay a woman who had experienced repudiation, treachery, controversy, and insurrection yet persisted. When she passed away in 1796, she bequeathed an empire that had been reshaped, but also lingering uncertainties. Could she have undertaken additional efforts to abolish serfdom? And did her Enlightenment values become undermined by political considerations? Was she predominantly a reformer or a ruler? History recalls her through the designation she never assigned to herself, the Great. This was not due to her being perfect, benevolent, or fair. It was because she grasped authority and exercised it according to her own conditions, in an era and setting where women were expected to possess none. She did not merely don the crown, she redefined the very notion of earning one. Deep within the damp wilderness of the Chiapas rainforest in southern Mexico, the remnants of Palenque murmur tales from the ancient Maya civilization. Lofty pyramids ascend above the treetops, their limestone exteriors worn away by the ages yet still teeming with mysteries. Back in 1994, a hidden secret came to light. A group of Mexican archaeologists, headed by Fanny Lopez Jimenez, were exploring Temple 13th. This pyramid, quite unassuming, stood beside the renowned Temple of the Inscriptions, the final resting place of the powerful King Pakal. The Grand Temple of Thon didn't seem to contain much at first. Then the team spotted something unusual, a concealed, sealed chamber under the building. It remained untouched by grave robbers, completely intact. After breaking through and climbing down, they discovered a silent stone sarcophagus. The atmosphere felt thick with the passing of ages. When they lifted the lid, a cloud of red dust billowed up vivid, startling crimson. The inside was coated with powdered cinnabar, a poisonous mercury sulfide employed in Maya rituals. And there, amidst that scarlet haze, lay the skeleton of a woman interred with great respect and devotion. Her skeletal remains were delicate yet whole, a jade mask still covering her skull. Around her, burial gifts included necklaces, crowns, and ear ornaments made from jade and shell. Every aspect of the interment indicated nobility, but there were no inscriptions or glyphs to reveal her name. This was among the wealthiest female graves ever discovered in Mesoamerica. Still, it remained a complete mystery. Why was she covered in red powder? Who could she be? A queen? A priestess? Or maybe even the wife of Pakal? The team nicknamed her the Red Queen, a title that endured. Yet despite contemporary forensic methods, her identity remained uncertain. All they could confirm was that she lived in the 7th century during Palenque's golden era. Unlike typical Maya burial sites, hers was concealed, undisturbed, and deliberately secluded. Her interment went beyond ceremony. It was deeply spiritual. This woman was not intended to be recalled through written words. Instead, she was to be remembered via ritual, through hues, and through the enigma she created. The most eerie aspect of the Red Queen's grave was not her jade ornaments or the quiet of the locked room. It was the crimson powder. A heavy coating of crushed cinnabar blanketed every surface: the stone coffin, the walls, her remains, and even the grave goods. It stuck as if it were blood on rock. For the Maya, this was intentional. Cinnabar, derived from ground mercury sulfide, ranked among the most hallowed and hazardous materials in antiquity. The vivid red shade wasn't merely striking to the eye, it represented blood and new life. It embodied the vital energy linking the mortal and the celestial. The color red was holy. It was the hue of dawn, of offering, of life springing from death. This was more than symbolism, it had spiritual significance. Dusting the deceased with cinnabar was a rite designed to alter the corpse, not for everlasting preservation but for transformation. According to Maya cosmology, death was not a conclusion but a gateway, a transition to a different cosmic plane. Thus, the Red Queen, regardless of her identity, was being readied not merely for interment but for elevation to godhood. Yet there's another dimension. Cinnabar is poisonous. Extended contact can cause mercury toxicity, shaking, delusions, and even fatality. The Maya probably lacked knowledge of the chemical process, but they sensed its power. This substance was unstable, potent, perilous. Submerging a body in it was a statement that the deceased was not a typical human. In Palenque, only a handful of individuals were interred with cinnabar. Pakal the Great, the powerful ruler whose pyramid towers over the area, was among them. His corpse, similar to hers, was also drenched in the red mineral. That single fact fueled much conjecture. Could the Red Queen be his spouse, his mother, or another figure of comparable sacred rank? Her cranium rested on a bed of jaguar hide, yet another emblem of holiness. Nearby, implements of bone, obsidian knives, and small jade statues suggested ceremonies held either while she lived or posthumously in her tribute. Each element of her internment narrated a tale without text, a narrative of authority wrapped in mystery. A woman ready to journey into the underworld not quietly but via ritual, soaked in the shade of offering. Around the Red Queen's blood-colored remnants, silence reigned, interrupted solely by the shine of jade, shell, and obsidian. These were not simply decorations. They were gifts, each deliberately selected to travel with her into the Maya underworld, known as Gibalba. Flanking her were jade necklaces, ponderous and cool, their shiny surfaces still gleaming even after 3 centuries buried. Jade wasn't merely attractive. It was holy, regarded by the Maya as a token of everlasting existence. The stone embodied the green of corn, the vibrancy of the rainforest, and the spirit of the deities. Only high-ranking individuals received jade in their graves. The Red Queen had it adorning her chest, wrists, and ears. This was unmistakable evidence that during her lifetime she held power, and possibly even heavenly approval. Among the most spine-chilling artifacts was the jade burial mask, gently positioned on her visage. In contrast to Egypt's golden masks, this was understated. It consisted of numerous small mosaic pieces fitted together to replicate the shape of her cranium. This mask had a ceremonial purpose, shielding the spirit, maintaining individuality, and showing her as godly before the deities. Around her skeletal remains lay bone needles, obsidian blades, and shell items. These might have been ritualistic implements, or representations of her role as a priestess, healer, or noble matriarch. One bone pin bore an engraving faint yet meaningful, a faint whisper of her identity, now silenced by time, lain at her feet. Around the tomb's margins rested ceramic jars, still sealed, probably originally holding tributes like food, beverages, or incense to nourish her soul in the hereafter. The Maya thought the afterlife was a perilous voyage, multi-layered and full of trials. These objects were not indulgences. They were essential for the journey ahead. The burial chamber feels personal, not cluttered, but purposeful. There was no gold, no chariots, no grand display, only articles selected for their spiritual significance. It was a guide for the spirit. Via these artifacts, we perceive how the Maya viewed death, not as an end, but as a transfer of authority. The Red Queen was interred not for obscurity, but for elevation. Despite the magnificence of her resting place, a single eerie absence remains. No name, no engraving decorates her coffin, and no carved symbols on the walls reveal her identity. She was undoubtedly influential, yet her identity is a mystery. As soon as her burial chamber was uncovered, researchers started piecing together clues. The strongest hypothesis identifies the Red Queen as Zakbu Ajah, spouse of Kinich Janab Pakal, better known now as Pakal the Great, Palenque's most renowned monarch. Zakbu Ajah was far from merely Pakal's partner. She came from aristocratic lineage and wed into Palenque's royal family when she was young. She gave birth to a minimum of 3 sons, each achieving great prominence, and she performed essential ceremonial duties throughout her husband's rule. If any individual deserved such an honorable burial, it was her. Additional evidence comes from the tomb's position, only a short distance from Pakal's own magnificent interment within the Temple of the Inscriptions. This closeness implies an intentional union, king and queen together beyond the grave. Moreover, there's the matter of the cinnabar. Within Palenque, just 2 graves contained such heavy layers of cinnabar, those of Pakal and the Red Queen. This seems far from accidental, yet the enigma intensifies. Genetic analyses were performed on both skeletons to verify the relationship, but the findings were ambiguous. The female remains did not display a direct maternal connection to Pakal. However, this does not eliminate the possibility of a marital bond. After all, matrimony doesn't necessitate genetic kinship. Certain scholars propose she might be Sak Cook, Pakal's influential mother, who governed Palenque until her son reached adulthood. Alternative theories propose she was a high-ranking priestess, a sibling, or a forebear whose identity eroded over time. Nonetheless, the evidence leans heaviest toward Zak Bu Ajah, a queen in rank, mother to monarchs, and Pakal's spiritual equal. The absence of a name might be deliberate rather than an error. Within Maya belief, a spirit endured not via stone structures but through ceremonies, emblems, and the subtle murmurs of the earth. Thus, the Red Queen hovers between myth and reality, a female sovereign whose memory survives not in carved text but in vermilion and quiet. Comprehending the Red Queen requires grasping the era she belonged to, a time when Maya noblewomen wielded far greater sway than commonly acknowledged. Politics in Maya society was frequently familial. Female royals were not just submissive companions. They served as negotiators, spiritual leaders, and influential power players. These women performed sacred rites, funded temple construction, and were vital for preserving dynastic authenticity. Their genealogies functioned as political currency to create coalitions and strengthen throne claims. Consider, for instance, Sak Cook, Pakal the Great's mother. Upon a power vacuum in Palenque, she assumed authority as regent queen, governing until her son matured. She was no mere stand-in. She governed legitimately, publishing proclamations and supervising building initiatives. Without her, Pakal might never have ascended, and her case was not unique. Throughout the Maya realm, at sites such as Yaxchilan, Naranjo, and Calakmul, carved texts depict women leading important rituals, participating in combat, handling diplomatic affairs, and occasionally governing independently. They frequently appear on monuments and wall paintings, wearing ornate headpieces and ceremonial attire, positioned next to rulers as peers or even superior. Their utterances were inscribed in glyphs, their names endured in recall for a while, then faded. Upon the arrival of Spanish conquerors many centuries after, most of that recollection had dissolved. The colonial viewpoint regarded indigenous women as voiceless beings within a patriarchal culture. Yet, archaeological evidence reveals a richer narrative. Intricate gender dynamics wherein authority was bargained, not merely passed down. Such historical context illuminates the Red Queen differently. She may not have been a titular sovereign. However, her lavish, hallowed interment adjacent to Pakal implies she was an essential support within the monarchy. Her jade face covering was not mere ornamentation. It represented her persona, authority maintained during life and safeguarded beyond death. Possibly her ancestry was the binding agent that kept Palenque's royal line intact. In Maya culture, a queen was far more than a monarch. She preserved the holy genealogy, had a say in rituals, and frequently served as a mediator between deities and humanity. The Red Queen's name may be lost, yet in her lifetime, she was by no means silenced. The Red Queen's interment went beyond mere wealth. She was laid to rest within architecture imbued with intention, steeped in Maya cosmology, ceremonial meaning, and deliberate planning. Her burial chamber was not just a tomb. It was a portal to everlasting life. Her remains were found inside Temple the 13th, a modest pyramid at the core of Palenque. Nevertheless, its closeness to the Temple of the Inscriptions, where Pakal the Great rests, is significant. These structures were not erected haphazardly. Their locations were hallowed, dictated by celestial bodies, mythology, and lineage. Temple 13th stands humbly alongside its impressive neighbor, yet it conceals something far more personal, a sealed burial chamber, unviolated by robbers, impeccably maintained. The tomb was built far inside the pyramid's center, reachable solely via a narrow, steep flight of stairs. Descending to her final resting place seems almost emblematic, a ceremonial voyage into the underworld. The room is bare, constructed from dressed stone, hermetically closed for more than 13 centuries, with no carved texts or paintings on its surfaces. Elaborate reliefs do not narrate her tale, yet maybe that quiet is purposeful. This chamber was designed not for the living to decipher, but for the deceased to undergo transformation. In the middle, her limestone sarcophagus rests like a sacrificial table, reminiscent of the magnificent stone coffin of neighboring Pakal. Whereas Pakal's coffin lid is renowned for its carvings depicting celestial resurrection, the Red Queen's resting place is comparatively restrained. The emphasis turns inward upon the corpse, the vermilion, the very ceremony of dying. Still, delicate architectural details subtly suggest deeper significance. Oriented from east to west, the tomb represents the sun's trajectory from life to death. Despite its modest size, the chamber exudes power. It seems intentional and intimate, a hallowed space for a venerated individual. Maya temples functioned as cosmic instruments, linking the sky, the ground, and the underworld. Being interred in such a space meant rising above mortal existence. The Red Queen's final resting place was no mere afterthought. It was a meticulously built sanctuary where death was transformed into rebirth. Her skeleton lies encased in rock, her spirit preserved in cinnabar, and her memory endures in the very structure, a silent temple that proclaims her significance. For the ancient Maya, death did not signal an ending. It represented a doorway, a holy transition into the underworld called Xibalba. For a figure such as the Red Queen, this journey was not merely spiritual. It carried political, cosmological, and profoundly ritual dimensions. Funeral ceremonies were meticulously orchestrated performances grounded in mythology, designed to lead the spirit through the perilous levels of the underworld. According to Maya writings and art, Xibalba was far from a tranquil hereafter. It consisted of a labyrinth of shadows, torrents of gore, ordeals, and death deities. A successful passage was possible only for those who received correct burial, ritual preparation, and spiritual tools. The Red Queen was interred swathed in cinnabar, sealed within rock, and accompanied by grave goods, clear markers of high status entombment. Yet there is another layer. Bone needles and obsidian knives discovered in her grave suggest ceremonies involving self-sacrifice. These might have been emblematic implements representing rituals she enacted while alive or that were performed during her interment to fortify her soul. Her death mask, painstakingly crafted from jade pieces, had a purpose beyond ornamentation. It could have functioned as a spiritual container, safeguarding her visage and identity throughout her passage into the next world. According to Maya cosmology, the face reflected the soul, and that soul required acknowledgement by the deities. The pottery placed around her might have originally contained cacao, corn, water, or even pulque, intended to sustain her in the afterlife. Additional objects such as stingray barbs or conch trumpets might have signified spiritual instruments, invocations to the gods, or emblems of ceremonial interaction. Interment was not merely a farewell, it was a metamorphosis. The Maya held that life moved in cycles. Death as a seed, burial as sowing, and the afterlife as renewal. Rulers were frequently regarded as mortal manifestations of deities, and upon death they reverted to those celestial roots. The Red Queen, bathed in blood-red pigment, buried inside a pyramid, and venerated with gifts, was being readied for resurrection, not as a human, but as an entity bound to the holy structure of the universe. Her entombment did not conclude her narrative. It marked the genesis of her myth. Only a short distance from the Red Queen's last home sits one of Mesoamerica's most renowned burial chambers, that of Kinich Jena Pakal, commonly referred to as Pakal the Great. His interment within the Great Temple of the Inscriptions is renowned for its craftsmanship, magnitude, and profound religious iconography. However, what renders the Red Queen's grave truly remarkable is not merely its contents, but its location. Her stone coffin was concealed inside Temple Threed, immediately next to Pakal's monument. In a metropolis such as Palenque, where each temple was deliberately aligned to mirror cosmic laws, this proximity was not accidental. It was deliberate, a declaration carved into rock. Numerous researchers think the Red Queen was Tsak Bu Aja, Pakal's spouse and loyal partner. Although her grave bears no writings, the parallels between their interments are remarkable. Both were swathed in cinnabar, placed within pyramids, laid to rest with jade, and honored with profound devotion. These rites reflect one another, as though they were two pieces of a divine story. Pakal's sarcophagus cover famously shows him descending into the world tree, a celestial portrayal of demise and renewal. The Red Queen's simpler tomb, however, lacks such imagery. It holds no similar imagery. Instead, the meaning emerges from the coupling itself. If Pakal embodied the sun traveling through the underworld at night, only to ascend once more, then the Red Queen might have embodied the moon, the feminine energy that traces its own enigmatic course across the heavens. As a pair, they personified a universal duality, male and female, monarch and consort, day and night, structure and ceremony. In Maya belief, sovereignty was not solitary, it was interdependent. Cosmic equilibrium demanded symmetry, and that symmetry reached into the royal household. By entombing the Red Queen alongside Pakal, the Maya were perpetuating not merely a union but a celestial alliance. Their closeness in death likely reflected their functions during life. She was a ruler not secondary to but alongside her king, sharing not only a seat of power but an enduring heritage. Within their graves, they communicate silently, two spirits cocooned in vermilion and rock, united for eternity, a hallowed quiet in the annals of time. Although her identity has been erased by history, the Red Queen of Palenque persists. She stands not as an overlooked artifact, but as one of antiquity's most mysterious and influential female figures. Her burial chamber, shuttered for more than 13 centuries, now murmurs through the ages, raising queries that grow more resonant with each find. She embodies a riddle that continues to elude complete comprehension. We may never learn her precise identity. No hieroglyph recorded her name, no stone monument narrated her tale, yet the meticulousness of her interment endures. The abundance of her grave goods and the meaning behind her scarlet-stained remains all point to a woman of immense significance, not simply as a spouse or partner, but as an individual who wielded actual power, religious authority, and noble lineage. Nowadays, the Red Queen compels us to reconsider our preconceptions. She serves as a testament that within ancient Maya society, women were not voiceless. They conducted ceremonies, ruled urban centers, and molded royal lines. Although sovereigns such as Pakal have historically occupied the limelight, the Red Queen's return to light reminds us that authority was not exclusively male. It coursed through mothers, monarchs, religious leaders, and seers. What she left behind goes beyond mere artifacts. It's the dialogue she sparked among archaeologists, historians, artists, and storytellers. Each jade bead, every layer of cinnabar, and all the architectural details within the Temple of the Theed were chosen with purpose. This woman held significance, and perhaps that's what makes her tale so remarkable. Not what is known, but what remains unknown. The Red Queen reminds us that history isn't simply a compilation of facts. It's an ever-evolving enigma, a collective human desire to connect with bygone eras. Thus, her story continues to unfold. She rests covered in red, the hue of life and sacrifice, of blood and renewal. Her face, once concealed by a jade mask, now gazes back at us through science, creativity, and awe. She remains unnamed but never unheard, mysterious yet unforgettable. The Red Queen may have governed a realm while alive, but in death she oversees something far greater, our imagination. Her tomb was sealed in stone, her narrative written in silence, yet still she communicates. Frida Kahlo entered the world on the 6th of July 1907, in the lively neighborhood of Coyoacan, then a small town on the outskirts of Mexico City. Her childhood residence, Casa Azul, overflowed with color, contradiction, and quiet fortitude. It would eventually become a refuge, a battlefield, and a museum dedicated to one of the 20th century's most famous artists. Frida was the third of 4 girls, born to Guillermo Carlo, a photographer of German-Hungarian origin, and Matilda Calderón, a devout Catholic with indigenous and Spanish heritage. Her parents were quite different. Guillermo was reserved and intellectual, while Matilda was religious and emotionally detached. Frida would inherit her father's introspection and artistic talent, along with her mother's fierce determination. As a youngster, Frida was creative, outspoken, and daring. She devoured books and posed queries most adults avoided. However, at age 6, she caught polio, leaving her right leg weaker and thinner. She attempted to conceal this physical disparity with long dresses, but never let it restrict her ambitions. The disease kept her bedridden for months and isolated from peers. During that period, she bonded with her father, who motivated her to exercise, cycle, and keep her mind active. Unlike most girls of her era, Frida didn't dream of marriage or housekeeping. She aimed to become a doctor. At 15, she entered the prestigious National Preparatory School in Mexico City, one of only a few girls admitted. She stood out not only for her intellect but also for her rebellious humor, progressive ideas, and distinctive fashion sense. She became part of a circle of young thinkers called the Cachuchas, who discussed philosophy, literature, and politics. Frida was attracted to revolution and concepts that defied convention. Yet even in those early days, before the bus accident that would shape her physique, Frida Kahlo was already painting her way into existence. And before the fame that would define her legacy, she painted with sharp lines, unapologetic themes, and an identity too vast for anyone else's standards. She wasn't merely maturing in Coyoacan, She was getting ready to entirely reinvent herself. On the 17th of September 1925, Frida Kahlo's existence was split in two: the girl she had been and the woman she was compelled to become. That afternoon, she climbed onto a wooden bus with her boyfriend Alejandro Gomez Arias after class. They were laughing, teasing one another, and likely arguing. Frida never did anything halfway. But moments later, the bus crashed into a streetcar, and instantly her future dissolved into agony, twisted metal, and silence. The collision was devastating. The streetcar forced the bus against a wall, shattering wood and tossing passengers. Frida was pierced by an iron handrail. It went through her left hip and exited her pelvis. Her spine was broken in 3 places. Her right leg was shattered, her foot dislocated, and her collarbone, ribs, and shoulder were fractured. Her abdomen was penetrated, and she was merely 18 years old. A man covered her with a borrowed coat. Someone else observed that her body glittered, not from blood but from the gold powder she had carried in a pouch. It had burst on impact, coating her shattered form in what seemed like shimmering dust. Frida was transported to the Red Cross hospital and endured multiple operations over the next months. She spent weeks in a body cast, lying flat on her back, immobile, suffering from infection and uncertainty. The future she had envisioned as a doctor slipped away day by day. Yet in that stillness, something started to emerge. Her father gave her brushes, and her mother set up a special easel above her bed. A mirror was placed on the canopy, so she could see herself. And there, wrapped in plaster and pain, Frida started to paint, initially from boredom, then from obsession. Her first subjects were her own reflection because that was all she had. But what emerged wasn't narcissism, it was survival. The crash had shattered her physically, yet it also unlocked a door into her inner world, her own body, and eventually into the surreal vocabulary of suffering and identity that would characterize her work. The girl who wished to heal others now began healing herself, one brushstroke at a time. As Frida Kahlo lay imprisoned in plaster and metal, her body battling itself with every breath, she started to paint. What began as a kind of therapy soon evolved into a means of expression. That expression was deeply intimate, brutally honest, and often challenging to behold, and that was exactly the intention. Frida didn't create delicate blooms or serene landscapes. She depicted pain, her own suffering, both physical and emotional, as well as existential. Her initial pieces were self-portraits, not due to vanity, but because, as she famously remarked, "I paint myself because I'm so often alone, and because the subject I know best is myself." Her early works were miniature in scale, painted on tin or wooden panels. They drew inspiration from Mexican retablos, devotional artworks meant to recount tales of suffering and miracles. Frida turned this tradition inward. Her body became the canvas, and her emotions became the altar. She depicted herself as torn apart, punctured, and bleeding. In one piece, she is nailed as if she were a contemporary martyr. In another, she drifts over a desolate terrain, bound to a shattered pillar, a symbol for her broken back. She showed herself crying, fractured, headless, and naked, but never inactive, always observing. Her agony wasn't cleaned up. She depicted the harshness of suffering with grace, rebellion, and sometimes wit. Every work reclaimed her physical form, her lived encounters, and her feminine self, in a society that frequently wanted to label her. Yet Frida was doing more than narrating her own life. She created a fresh style of visual storytelling that fused Mexican folk traditions, surrealist elements, medical diagrams, and symbolic imagery. Her canvases turned into surreal examinations of her inner self, set within hues, heritage, and legend. When she finally regained the ability to move, though with difficulty, Frida had transformed from the young woman who once dreamed of becoming a physician. She had become a creator, and her work was completely original. She transformed the most terrible event in her life into a wellspring of artistic output. Frida Kahlo didn't merely depict her suffering, she compelled everyone to witness it. In that process, she converted anguish into a holy form of personal articulation. By 1928, Frida Kahlo, at only 21, continued to heal and to create art. She encountered the person who would define her most intense and stormy partnership, Diego Rivera. He was 2 decades older, already Mexico's leading artist, imposing in both physical size and charisma. Rivera stood as a titan of Mexican mural painting, famous for his expansive, politically charged wall paintings that narrated the history of the Mexican nation. Frida had previously viewed his pieces and appreciated them, but now she sought his feedback on her own creations. She carried her canvases to him at the Ministry of Education, disrupting his work on a scaffolding to ask directly, "Am I talented?" Diego glanced at them and affirmed her gift, and his reply wasn't merely polite. He saw in her a unique quality, an uncensored expression that was blunt and honest, brimming with anger, sarcasm, anguish, and loveliness. Their connection started, equally all-encompassing and artistic. Frida once stated, "I endured two mishaps in my existence. First, a trolley struck me. Second was Diego. They wed in 1929, appearing to others as an unusual match. Diego huge, unfaithful, politically renowned. Frida quick-witted, strongly self-reliant, already using a walking stick. Her family described it as a union of an elephant and a dove. Their relationship was intense, yet disorderly. Diego backed her artistic endeavors and urged her development as a painter, yet he was perpetually disloyal, including an affair with Frida's sibling Cristina. Frida was heartbroken, and in response she engaged in her own romantic liaisons with individuals of both sexes, among them whispered connections with Leon Trotsky and artist Georgia O'Keeffe. They ended their marriage in 1939 and reunited the following year under new conditions. Now Frida retained her independence, her residence, her finances, and her surname. This second union focused less on conventional romance and more on artistic collaboration and shared comprehension. Even with the treacheries and emotional pain, Diego stayed a steady influence in Frida's existence. He provoked her, he hurt her, yet he also had faith in her as a painter, a rebel, and a female who could transform the possibilities of art. During the 1930s, Frida Kahlo accompanied Diego Rivera on a trip northward to San Francisco, Detroit, and New York City. He finished prominent mural projects. This period overseas exposed her directly to American industry, affluence, and the inconsistencies of capitalist systems, leading to profound political unease. Frida took pride in Mexican nationalism, was a dedicated communist, and deeply respected native customs. The lavishness she observed in America, particularly during the widespread hardship of the Great Depression, intensified her feelings of disenchantment. In correspondence sent back home, she ridiculed the society's focus on possessions and preoccupation with image. She longed for the roughness, vibrancy, and paradoxes of Mexico as Diego worked on huge factory frescoes. Frida started creating more modest, subtle upheavals, intensely private pieces on metal and cloth. Her approach became defined, incisive, dreamlike, heartfelt, and personal. In this phase, she created many of her most famous self-portraits. Frida didn't depict herself out of vanity. She did so to endure, and her own being turned into her scenery, continually suffering from her crash, numerous operations, and a miscarriage in Detroit. She looked inside. Her self-eye images displayed her as wounded, broken, vulnerable, yet her expression stayed serene, straightforward, and without apology. Among her most striking pieces is Henry Ford Hospital, depicting her reclining on a medical bed, weeping while encircled by hovering signs of grief. An unborn child, a mollusk, surgical tools, a damaged pelvic bone. The work was stark, explicit, and profoundly moving, a painting that wept with honesty. Once she returned to Mexico, Frida became deeply involved in left-wing political activism. Together with Diego, she hosted Leon Trotsky in their residence during his period of exile. Frida donned Tijuana outfits, traditional native clothing, not merely as style but as a political and cultural declaration. Her artwork was always linked to her convictions. Her personal being, her flesh, and her worldview merged in every piece. As Rivera created huge wall paintings of rebellion, Frida depicted the toll it took on people: shattered bodies, blazing minds, and a gaze that never looked away. While she endured exile and sickness, she transformed from merely an artist of agony into an artist of defiance. Upon her return to Mexico in the latter part of the 1930s, Frida Kahlo was no longer simply Diego Rivera's partner. She had evolved into something wholly different. A powerhouse, a creator whose pieces shone with unvarnished truth, dreamlike metaphors, and ethnic pride. In her native land, she fully embraced her own nature. Her blue house in Coyoacán evolved into a refuge of vibrancy and paradox. Vivid azure walls, golden edging, indigenous sculptures in the yard, with monkeys and parrots roaming unrestrained. This home served as a vivid manifestation of Frida's fantasy, a fusion of heritage and defiance, refinement and nature. In this space, she immersed herself in pre-Columbian relics, devotional paintings, folk crafts, and radical literature. She adorned herself in striking Tijuana gowns and wove blossoms into her hair. While painting, she was surrounded by the fragrance of copal incense and mariachi music drifting in from the street. This era saw a burst of creative energy, with her art growing increasingly complex, symbolic, and politically charged. For example, in The Two Fridas, she depicts a split identity, one figure wearing European attire with a heart that bleeds, the other in traditional indigenous garments. Frida's work served as a powerful visual autobiography, capturing themes of love, grief, and cultural roots. In 1939, she showed her pieces in Paris, earning admiration from greats such as Picasso, Breton, and Kandinsky for her boldly unique approach. Yet even within surrealist circles, she remained distinct when André Breton attempted to categorize her as a surrealist. She resisted that label. "They considered me a surrealist," she remarked, "but I was not. I never depicted dreams. I painted my actual reality." Instead of portraying an idealized tourist version of Mexico, she captured the vibrant, authentic nation she loved. Her canvases overflowed with symbolic imagery: skeletons, hummingbirds, hearts, thorns, corn, and blood. She paid tribute to Mexico's indigenous heritage while also exposing the brutality of both its history and contemporary life. However, as her artistic expression flourished, her physical condition worsened. Surgeries, infections, and persistent pain became routine. Even so, she continued to create art while lying in bed, her body strapped into corsets, fingers gripping the paintbrush. Frida came back to Mexico not for a respite, but to reassert her strength via painting, political activism, and an unapologetic acceptance of who she was. As the 1940s progressed, her physical state kept failing her, her spine weakened, and her right leg suffered from chronic infections. Over her life, she endured over 30 operations, frequently one after another in exhausting sequences. For months at a time, she was confined to bed, wrapped in plaster casts, or held still by traction equipment that pulled her bones apart. Yet she never stopped painting. Every artwork from those years served as an emotional outlet and a form of defiance. Her paintings became more somber and rebellious. She created with a precision honed by suffering, never disguising her truths through allegory. In The Broken Column, she shows herself split open, nails piercing her flesh, with a shattered ionic column in place of her spine. Despite this, her expression remains calm and her stare unwavering. For Frida, pain evolved beyond a mere theme. It became her constant companion, adversary, and inspiration. At the same time, her political convictions intensified. She became a member of the Mexican Communist Party, participated in protests, penned passionate letters, and denounced imperialism and inequality. Once she could no longer walk due to illness, she still showed up at demonstrations in a wheelchair, proudly brandishing placards and chanting slogans. In 1953, Mexico finally honored her with a solo exhibition, an event that was far past due. However, her physical condition was extremely delicate. Physicians advised her not to come. Naturally, she responded in typical Frida fashion. An ambulance brought her, and she was lifted onto a stretcher, then positioned in the middle of the exhibition hall atop her hospital bed, adorned in traditional festive clothing. Encircled by her art, she welcomed visitors with tequila, laughter, and an unmistakable spark in her gaze. The last pieces she created were simultaneously innocent and deeply disturbing. In Marxism Will Give Health to the Sick, she depicts herself in a metal corset, held gently by Marx's hands while discarding emblems of oppression. Her final known painting is a still life featuring watermelon slices, with one piece inscribed "Viva la vida, long live life." Right up to the end, she stayed rebellious, cheerful, and politically engaged. Frida Kahlo's final self-portraits were more than mere depictions of herself. They were revolutionary statements, created through agony yet always infused with vitality. On the 13th of July 1954, at 47 years old, she passed away in the very house where she came into the world, La Casa Azul in Coyoacán. The official record attributed her death to a pulmonary embolism, yet her inner circle murmured about a more profound cause. Certainly, she had been sick, but she was also drained from constant pain, repeated operations, and the endless battle against her own flesh. Only a few days earlier, she had participated in a demonstration opposing the CIA-backed coup in Guatemala. Though frail and confined to a wheelchair, she demanded to attend, raising a tight fist high. Even at the very end, revolution pulsed through her veins. The final words in her journal were short but sharp. "I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return." Her memorial service took place at the Palacio de Bellas Artes, the foremost cultural venue in Mexico. They covered her body with the red banner of the Mexican Communist Party. Friends, relatives, fellow artists, and activists kept vigil. Diego Rivera was devastated. He declared her the deepest love he ever knew, despite his infidelities having almost destroyed her. Yet after she passed, an incredible transformation began to unfold. Frida Kahlo simply would not fade away. Initially, only those within art communities spoke her name quietly. Her pieces defied easy classification: too politically charged for surrealists, too surreal for conventionalists. Over time, however, her likeness, narrative, and rebellious spirit started to echo through the 1970s and 80s as feminist academics and campaigners revived overlooked narratives. Frida's presence grew stronger. She transcended being solely a painter. She came to represent suffering transformed into elegance, feminism forged through struggle, and Mexican heritage embraced unashamedly. She embodied queerness, disability, rebellion, and genuine selfhood. Her distinctive features, the unibrow, steady eyes, and floral headdress, became legendary. Her residence was turned into a museum, her personal journal took on the status of a revered manuscript, and her artworks are exhibited in top institutions globally. Throughout much of her existence, Frida Kahlo remained in Diego Rivera's shadow, but after dying, she emerged into the light. She left more than just paintings, she handed us a mirror and challenged everyone to gaze into it, not with sympathy or dread, but with fierce energy in the present day. Frida Kahlo's image appears all around us on t-shirts, in mural art, as dolls, and in internet memes. Her trademark unibrow, flower-adorned hair, and unwavering stare are instantly identifiable. Yet the strength of her legacy lies not merely in widespread recognition of her face, but in the fact that viewers understand the reality it represents. Frida never aspired to be perfect. She refused to be categorized. She was unconventional and never concerned herself with fitting in. In a society obsessed with flawlessness, she offered authenticity, unpolished, chaotic, lively, furious, happy, and full of contradictions. She embraced everything that set her apart, her physical condition, her sexuality, her beliefs, her heritage, and transformed it into artwork that crossed all boundaries. Over the years, she has evolved beyond being merely an artist. She now represents worldwide defiance of feminism, cultural heritage, and artistic opposition for LGBTQ+ groups. She was a courageous bisexual symbol who existed publicly and without regret during an era that expected women to remain quiet. She stands as evidence that authority doesn't need approval for creators with disabilities. She demonstrates that suffering can drive the paintbrush rather than halt it. And for Mexico, she is a daughter who has been restored bold, traditional, and eternally woven into the country's spirit. Her artworks, previously written off as overly odd or intimate, now rank among the most cherished globally. Pieces such as the two Fridas, self-portrait with thorn necklace and hummingbird, and the broken column are not merely viewed. They resonate profoundly with everyone who has experienced pain and felt compelled to transform that pain into something holy. She existed on the outskirts and transformed those edges into the spotlight. She welcomed opposing ideas. A leftist who adorned herself in jewelry, a female who was deceived yet found love once more, a physical form shattered yet possessing an indestructible spirit. Throughout everything, she created art not only using pigment but with unwavering belief. Frida Kahlo never requested to become an emblem. She merely spoke honestly about her own life. And by doing that, she expressed the reality for countless individuals. Individuals who had never before witnessed their own likeness in creative works. Today, whenever we observe her visage, we witness bravery, we witness vibrancy, we witness opposition, we witness Frida not deceased but everlasting.